Thank you very much. Afternoon, everyone. Are you having a good time at the Skills Show? I think it's a very inspiring place to be. I've absolutely loved walking around this morning and seeing what people are at. I was at the World Skills Championship about 10 years ago in South Korea, and seeing all the different nations compete against each other was absolutely wonderful in lots of different trades. I'm a garden designer, and I like to create gardens that are different. Who's interested in garden design? Right, I'm going to convince the rest of you why it's a particularly good skill to have, and why there's so many different careers that you can go into if you become a garden designer. I started off with a garden like this. Does anybody find this familiar? This is the type of garden I grew up with, which was, what do you think? Is it a bit boring? Just a kind of plot of grass in the suburbs of Dublin. And this is actually my uncle's garden, my Uncle Chris's garden. And even though I quite like the idea of being outdoors and I love design, this didn't inspire me. The things that I did quite like was the natural landscape. This is something called a dolmen, which is an ancient burial ground in County Clare in Ireland. The natural landscape is really beautiful. This is Gugambara in County Cork. Pastoral landscapes. This is a place that Capability Brown made in Derbyshire. Different landscapes from all around the world. Baboa trees in Madagascar, absolutely wonderful. So inspiration really comes from everywhere. The type of landscape that I absolutely love is very, very simple one actually. It's sand dunes, so right beside the sea, the marron grass, rustling in the winds, different color you get from that sort of foliage. But I also like quirky landscapes. And this is a wonderful street. It's one of my favorite gardens in the world. It's in San Francisco. And I brought my daughter, who is 8, I brought her out there last year. And imagine driving down that road. It would drive any driver demented, because it's about 18 different turns. But it's a garden full of hydrangeas. And it used to be, what was the television show? There was a great television show years ago with, was it the Streets of San Francisco with Michael Douglas that it was in the opening credits of. So just quirky, odd, colourful things I really like. A garden in New Zealand. The sun is very bright today. We should be thankful for this, especially being a gardener, but it's interfering with the sun. This is a field of lavender in Provence in France, and just the commercially grown lavender and the furrows of that field and the undulations. It reminds me of a little bit of a Teletubbies landscape. So anything that's slightly quirky, anything that's slightly silly, I particularly appreciate. Odd landscapes, the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, and what is Willy Wonka doing there? Anybody like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory? Well, Charlie would be my big inspiration in terms of garden creating. So how do you match the mad things and his mad dreams, the stuff that he was creating, with gardens? Well, you'd think a little bit differently about gardens. I left school way back in 1982 in Dublin. I worked in a garden shop for 3 years, and then I went to college. And I was taught how to create gardens that were absolutely beautiful, and gardens that rich people would love, and gardens that my parents would enjoy. But if you were watching, do you remember Top of the Pops or Star Trek or Doctor Who or anything like that, and you liked playing football outside, what was going to engage you? What type of garden would you find really exciting? So my journey was really deciding to make gardens that I enjoyed. So these would have been my big influences, whether it was Dr. Spock in Star Trek, whether it was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, or whether it was the natural landscape. So a whole range, or some other really great gardeners. There's a funny guy, Roberto Burle Marx, and he's from Brazil, and he loved design and fabric design and graphic design, and he loved the native flora of Brazil, and he liked having fun in gardens. So he became a mentor or an inspiration to me. But people's idea of what futuristic cities and gardens would be, I found quite amusing too. And just, as I say, quirky things in gardens. This is, somebody was having a party and they decided, in Oxford, and they decided to put 3 elephants made of grass into their garden. So all these sort of ideas that I like, different materials used. And I went and I started doing a few garden shows in Dublin and created a few very pretty gardens and won a couple of gold medals, but it wasn't really getting me anywhere. And I found myself, that's the second garden I created in Dublin. I found myself having trained to be a garden designer, and I wasn't young, I was 29, and I was failing hopelessly because I wasn't doing a good job. And I wasn't doing a good job because nobody would allow me to take any inspiration from Willy Wonka or from anybody else. Everything had to be, to my mind, boring or straight. And this is a place then that changed my life. When I was 29, I came across, myself and my friend, we had 2 suitcases each, we had 300 quid in our pockets, and we knocked on the door of the Royal Horticultural Society in Vincent Square in London. And I asked them, could I make a garden at the Chelsea Flower Show? And this is the first place that they gave me to make a garden way back in 1995. I came over and made a garden, and it wasn't particularly interesting. I thought if they let me in, I'd make one garden that everybody would like, and then the following year I'd come back and I'd make a garden that would change the world and be madly dramatic and would be very, very different. So I came along, and I don't know if you can make it out there, I made this romantic Irish garden in 1994, a ruined tower and lots of green planting. And nobody really noticed it, but it was grand. We sold it, we had enough money to get home. I came back the following year, and the following year's garden was, do you know a Michael Jackson video where, I think it's Billie Jean, anybody know that? Michael Jackson, before he was kind of mad, he danced down the street, and every time his feet touched the paving slabs illuminated. So I did a garden at Chelsea that lit up when you stood on it, and you could, another part of it had a big glass wall with futuristic plants that you might find on a Star Trek set in Los Angeles, big creepy architectural plans, Michael Jackson dance floor, and nobody cared because it wasn't very good. And I stood in front of this garden thinking this was the garden that was going to change my life. And after a couple of days, I knew it wasn't, nothing was going to happen. But then what happened towards the end of the week in Chelsea, it appeared on television, and whereas in real life it looked a bit iffy, on television it looked absolutely fantastic. So by the end of the week it had been on the Gardener's World programme, and I was getting approaches, would I do this, would I do that, would I do the other? So I set off beginning to make the type of gardens that I wanted. Contemporary gardens, gardens that were very different to that lawn and borders that had been, I'd made for my parents' family, or I'd made all around Dublin. This was a garden where I felt people were very confused by gardening, especially young people. So I decided, would we lift everything out of a garden and put it in trays? So the whole lawn that my uncle might have had is lifted up, and it floats, one lawn floats over another, and you have trees coming up through it, and then a very futuristic background cladding a shed. This was a kind of my idea of a time tunnel. So rather than just a path going right the way through a garden, you had a time tunnel going over a bog garden in South London. And this was a very exciting one. Do you know the model Jerry Hall? She was married to Mick Jagger for a good few years. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I hired Jerry Hall. And you know what they say models, about models not getting out of bed for less than 10 grand? Well, she cost 10 grand for a modeling session. And she came to, you know Louis Walsh from the X Factor? This was his flat in London. And her whole job for a day was just to lie on a bed. And we filmed her and we photographed her. And I designed a garden out of her. So you can see how Jerry Hall goes from being just a stationary model into, really it was somebody's lawn again. We used just grass contours. Actually, this was a challenge for a couple. I did a design up for a couple, and I said, they had said they wanted a garden with undulations. They were inspired by Lord of the Rings. And this was the design we came up. And they actually, I don't have any images of it, but they went and built it. So Jerry Hall is in the middle of Ireland, lying down somewhere, 125 foot long, 25 foot high at her highest peaks, and looking lovely for it. This is a garden that we did. So that was a very large garden. This is a tiny, probably the smallest garden we ever created for a hospital in Dublin. And you can see it's a tiny, tiny courtyard. But 125,000 children use this hospital every year. And the space wasn't much bigger than the space that I'm standing on here. It was just a light well or an alleyway. Some of the kids were only in hospital for a day. Some of the kids were in hospital for up to a year. And if they wanted any fresh air, they had to be put in a taxi and brought somewhere else, brought to a park. And that didn't suit everybody. So we were commissioned to create a garden that would look up at the sky to keep the children safe. It was in a fairly dangerous part of Dublin City. And this was the notion, to create a garden that was like a bit like an advent calendar. The walls, you could push on things in the walls and doors would pop open and there'd be toys and games behind. And we called it was inspired by Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. So there were to be big daisies and big flowers above, in a security grill above, and some sand pits and dens and all sorts. So this is, it's been made off-site in a field, and you can see this is the back of it. We lowered it into site at 6 o'clock one morning, and here's the security grill being put in place, and you can see it's sculptural, and that's a shot of the end. I don't know what you can make out there, but it's a magical garden that's really ruled by kids. You can see, you can push the doors here and all sorts of stuff popped out. We did hanging baskets in the shape of planets that the kids could winch up and down and even grow fruit and vegetables in. And there's a detail of the top of the garden, so you can see that the children can still feel the wind and rain and sunshine, but the whole thing becomes a big sculpture. So the type of gardens I like to do take inspiration from colourful, quirky things, garden buildings that are inspired by spaceships. This was a fun garden we did in Luton on a television show, a kind of 1930s Hollywood garden, and it has this egg at the end of it. Can you see the egg, that big silver thing? And the egg had some light. It was like a disco ball. We had lights going against it. And when the egg stopped, it became, when you opened the doors, it was a cocktail cabinet at the end of your garden. So anything that's a little bit different, a little bit of fun, that makes people think, that makes people smile, is really what I like. This is a garden we did in Altrincham in Manchester for one of David Beckham's teammates on a £1 million penthouse terrace, and it's a garden with sculptural canopies and nice big olive trees in pots, and a garden with a conservatory, which is a glass box in it. A garden in another hospital down in Surrey. A completely different requirement for this garden, because it's a hospital that serves the army, the community, and the royal family. And what one doctor in the hospital realizes, when we're going towards the end of our life, you know, it's a very sad time. It's a very sad time to be hooked up to all sorts of machinery and whatever. So he asked, could we make a garden in a hospital that had a pavilion in the garden for people to pass away in? So completely different requirement. So we have this pavilion, and when it's coming towards the end of somebody's life, they're wheeled out on a hospital trolley, and themselves and their families go into this room, and they still have whatever care they need, but at least they can pass away surrounded by nature and not surrounded by, you know, the grey or dark walls of a hospital ward. This is a garden, so taking inspiration from anywhere. This is very near where I grew up, just outside Dublin. And I'd been to New Zealand doing a travel show, working on another type of television program, and I'd seen kids playing with skateboards, and I'd seen the lines of these skateboards. And you know that program that's just about to start now, Ant and Dec, the jungle program? You know the swing bridge, you know when they're being evicted or when they walk over this bridge in the jungle. I took the lines and shapes of those bridges and the idea of skateboard ramps to inspire a pavilion. And can you make out the lines of the pavilion which sweep up into the sky? So it's almost an outback type garden, if it could be seen, with energy brought into the architecture, and lots of big dramatic plants used. Plants that I would imagine would grow in a jungle in Borneo or someplace. This was another garden by the coast, and inspired by Teletubby Land, we created a series of mounds and a pavilion that would let you sit in chairs and just swing away and look past subterranean, underground patios out to the sea. And this is that garden in the evening, at night, and the seats and the view beyond. Protecting people from the elements, letting them enjoy, having some shelter, giving some shelter and some protection to any plants that would be battered by the wind. So it's all fun. This is a garden I did at Chelsea about, I suppose about 9 or 10 years ago, based on the idea of Willy Wonka, using multicolored lollipops to try and have a little bit of sculptural form, to see if I could plant up a garden that was mainly using green species, but bringing that idea of 1950s post-war design and Willy Wonka and colour into a place. A pavilion in the shape of a rugby ball, which was hydraulically operated, covered in 5,000 enamelled steel spheres. It cost me £250,000 to create. I still think I'm paying for it. But it opened majestically, and it now nestles underneath some trees in a grand house just outside at Dublin. But anything that's shaped different, that's a little bit of fun, that makes people think in different ways. A Teletubby-inspired garden I also did at Chelsea. You can see, instead of standard garden buildings, we created these balls or orbs, or that could be outdoor offices, that could be potting sheds, that could house a jacuzzi, and we undulated the whole landscape and only used 2 species, clipbox and lavender, to plant it. So it was quite funny. Another more normal garden, again going back to that idea of the sweeping roof from the jungle program, to create 2 pavilions using flower power motifs in the paving that you can see there, with plants to the center of them, using ideas from graphic design, ideas from pop culture, ideas of just different colored walls, because we have so many grey concrete walls around us, to try and do something different. And a pavilion for a retired couple to sit and write or paint or whatever, and have a low maintenance garden around them. Recycling, very, very important, looking after the environment. These were 2 lounge chairs. We had 5 different types of chairs which represented different eras of this couple's lifestyle. So the bubble chairs from the 60s, the chairs made from recycled, the loungers made from recycled pallets, representing more today's care of the environment. Yeah, that was, I suppose, the most normal garden I ever did at Chelsea, and nice enough. So this was a relatively recent. Do you remember what happens in the end of Willy Wonka? Where does he go? Where does Wonka bring Charlie? What does he put him in? The Wonkavator, the Wonkavator. So I was imagining, the natural thing for me, the natural thing would be, if I wanted to follow Willy Wonka to extremes, would be to make a garden that would go up in the air, that you could fly up in the air. Do you think you could do that? Would anybody be up for the challenge? You see, all we're inhibited is by our imagination. So I wanted to make a garden that would fly. So I came up with this idea of creating a lovely garden that you'd walk through, that we'd put in the Chelsea Flower Show, and you'd walk down this pathway through this garden, and you'd come across this garden building, and you'd go in, and there'd be 2 benches in the garden building, and you'd sit on these benches, and all of a sudden it would rise up out of the ground and float in the clouds over all the crowds, giving you a new perspective, maybe on Chelsea, on the flower show, on gardening in general, and just pushing the boundaries a little bit. So this is how design often starts off. 2 pieces of cardboard pushed together gave us the shape of the building we wanted to create. And then I wanted whatever was happening up in the sky, I wanted reflected in dark pools down the ground, so you wouldn't have just to look up to see what was happening. You could look down and see the reflection. So this is how the model progressed. And I'll just walk over here. Sometimes when you're looking for details of your design, I wanted to do a pathway in this garden, and I couldn't figure out what the pathway on the ground would be to lead you up. And I was driving along the motorway, and I saw this van in front of me. And you see that S-shaped logo on the van? I did something very dangerous with the iPhone, took a snap of it, and that became the basis of the pathway which you walked through. This is the flying garden being constructed. This is going off to Belgium to buy absolutely massive trees that cost about 4,000 quid each. but I thought they were fun. They were a bit Edward Scissorhandsy. They had this idea of an arrow pointing up into the sky, and this was them at Chelsea. I don't know if you can make out that S-shaped pathway, all the crowds down below, and this was the pod, and there is the... What you're not seeing, of course, is the massive, gigantic crane that it took to make this garden fly. But we had an amazing time creating this garden that was hoisted above the crowds in Chelsea. Very beautiful green planting inspired by the Irish landscape at the end. And then for a whole week we had people like members of the royal family. I don't know who's in that. Oh, Helen Mirren is there with my mate Jerry, who helped me build a garden. So you had these people like John Major and Will Young and all sorts, who came for the ride in my... And that's Mrs. Alan Tishmarsh. I robbed her away from Alan for a while. And Will Young with a crazy man from Singapore. Just having fun. This was the garden that was on the ground, mimicking the Irish landscape, 40 shades of green in different shapes. So you had something very sedate, something very gentle, and then that mad thing. There's the black pools reflecting what was going on in the sky, and the garden in the sky. I went back to Chelsea the following year to create a different type of garden. I'd always wanted to create a garden on the water, on the river outside Chelsea, on the Thames, because quite often my ideas are too wacky and they don't really want to let me in the gates with my ideas. So, like a bit of a pirate that I am, I thought, well, could I do a garden on a raft? But I was having too much fun with the flying garden inside, so I decided, no, let's stay inside. But when I walked up and down the river, I saw one of the bridges covered in scaffolding, and I realized it might be possible. Hello. You all look very bright and cheerful. Have you come? Oh, very good. I bet you thought I was Monty Don or somebody. So I decided, would it be possible to make lots of gardens on top of each other using scaffolding, and how could you make that fun? So just imagine living in a city centre where space is at a premium. Could you make one garden on the ground and put another on top of that, and another, and another? And what if you did that? Could you build a slide into it that you might find at one of the fun fairs at Disneyland that would bring you all the way down? So we planned on making a garden with an elevator that brought you all the way up and a slide that brought you all the way down. And this is the planning for that. So this was one of our first drawings, giving the idea of it. Near Stansted Airport, we found a scaffolding firm, and this was them making a prototype of it. This was at Chelsea, and you can see we're looking out over the river. There's the fence of Chelsea. This is the back of our garden, looking from the scaffolding, and there's the stainless steel slide that's just arrived from Germany, our scaffolders, so all sorts of different skills. Scaffolders, in this case, working with gardeners, getting huge bamboos up to the fourth terrace in the sky. We had an oriental pavilion on the third floor of the garden. And there you can make out the garden coming together. And that was our, it was called the Westland Magical Tower Garden. And as I say, it had a slide that brought you all the way down. It had a lift that brought you all the way up. And it had 7 different sets of people who created different types of gardens on each level. And because it was Jubilee year, the show, the Chelsea Flower Show, takes place in the grounds of the Royal Hospital, and in the grounds of the Royal Hospital live these wonderful Chelsea pensioners. So I did a drawing of all the Chelsea pensioners standing on different levels of the garden, and I don't know if you can see them there. They all came on press day, and they had a salute to Her Majesty the Queen to celebrate the Golden Jubilee. So having fun, having different ideas, creating gardens that are slightly different. This is somebody going down the slide from the top level, and this was around the back of the garden. You can see it was the only garden in Chelsea that ever had a fairground built into it, but it was wonderful fun. And my little one Eppie, who's age 8, she was 7 there, she got to present Her Majesty a bouquet of flowers. Another garden that I'd love to do, so if Willy Wonka really wanted to create a garden, he'd incorporate a chocolate factory into it, wouldn't he? So I have this idea, and I rang up a great chef called Heston Blumenthal, and I asked him, because he's a bit of a Wonka with food and chocolate himself, and I asked him would he like to be involved. So we've both developed this plan. Garden plans start in odd ways. This time it was with Jenga. And then the Jenga, which I planned in a hotel room immediately after Chelsea one year. The Jenga blocks became drawings of shipping containers, and then they became drawings of a multi-story garden using 52 shipping containers, 5 stories high, different terraces of gardens, but incorporating lots of Oompa Loompas, production lines and chocolate making facilities. And all the plants that would be grown in this garden could be used in chocolate or confectionery making. So there's our plan for maybe a couple of years' time to create a massive chocolate factory garden. And that slide is the wrong way around, but we went to the docklands and we built it. We convinced the shipping companies to let us pretend we were using Lego blocks, but in fact they were massive shipping containers, and we built it that way. And then finally, just to show you a couple of images of probably my favorite garden anywhere, which is the High Line in New York. It was an old train line that ran through in the meatpacking district in New York. And over the last 5 or 6 years, they've created 1.5 miles of the most magnificent garden that floats above the city. So people thinking with real imagination and creating this corridor in the city where you can look into people's kitchens and bedrooms and God knows what as you walk across what was an old train track. And I've always, another place I've wanted to create a garden, and I'm going to end on this slide and see if you have any questions. This is a motorway in Cape Town in South Africa where we do a little bit of work. And they forgot to buy all the land to build the motorway. So, and one guy wouldn't sell. So the motorway ends just in the middle of the city, right beside the coast, with the most fantastic views. And my idea has always been to create a mad garden, to take over a roadway and to bring greenery to a place that it isn't. So that's what I do. I have an awful lot of fun. I've absolutely loved going into the world of horticulture and all the opportunities that has given me. Do you have any questions? Anybody like the idea of going and being a gardener, or any other questions about, about being a garden designer or the life of a garden designer? Right. 2 people here, so.
So what would you advise a typical 17, 18-year-old to study if they wanted to do what you do?
How would you advise 17 or 18-year-olds if they wanted a career in gardening? I think there's 2 different ways, and if I take Monty Dunn and Alan Titchmarsh as an example, 2 different examples. Monty Dunn became a brilliant gardener just by it being a hobby. He's never formally trained, but he absolutely loved doing it, so he began to garden for himself. So you can learn yourself, or as Alan Titchmarsh did, he went to Kew Gardens and did a diploma in Kew Gardens. I think getting a grounding in the science of gardening, it's all very well having big silly ideas and having an awful lot of fun, but unless you know the science of gardening, unless you know your plants, unless you know the Latin names of those plants, and in college I learned about 3,000 Latin names, and there were plant identification that give you a little bit of bark or a leaf every Friday afternoon. You'd have an exam and you'd have to give the genus and species of that. So getting that grounding is very good, or just going for work, identifying somebody who is very, very good at garden design, landscaping or garden maintenance, and going and doing an apprenticeship with them or a parks department. Nothing beats hand-on experience. But really with gardening, it's a hard job, whatever level you get to, so it's the passion for the industry that will keep you going in it. Is that okay? And there's another lady just here.
What would you recommend for a 12 by 12 like yard?
What would I recommend for a 12 by 12? A square concrete garden. Now, garden with containers is always fun. If it's concrete, there's going to be a huge amount of work in drilling that up. If you can do that, it's wonderful, because the plants will have access to water running off and whatever. But pots and containers are absolutely cram a place with pots and containers. And you can make containers from old oil drums and colour them very, very brightly, or go down to the chipper. You know those tins that they have pickled gherkins in and stuff like that. Anything like that. A collection of oddball containers can look really well. Keep them well watered, top dress them every year, and don't be afraid of putting big specimens in containers. You know, things like silver birches or whatever will do very well if you top dress and don't let them dry out. Any other questions?
working on at the moment? Because we never see you on TV now, and we really would like to.
Oh, you see, I moved back to Ireland about 5 or 6 years ago, so if you want to see me on TV, you have to move to Ireland. We do programs over there. But I'm still doing, do you know where I was last week? In South Fork, in Dallas, with Sue Ellen. So we do, I still do work with the This Morning show on ITV. And if we do the thing with Heston, we're going to make a series out of it, I think, for probably Channel 4 or something like that. So lots of ideas for the future. But at the moment, we have a series called Dirty Old Town running in Ireland, where we encourage communities to get out and take control themselves. Anybody else? Well, enjoy the rest of the afternoon. It's a fantastic show with so many different disciplines being represented here. Thank you very much.